childhood memories of walking home from school on Halloween Day. Cool breezes under overcast skies, the scratching of dried leaves on the pavement as the wind pushed them by. They crunched under my feet and made a swoosh, swoosh sound as I walked through them. When I got home, I raked them up into mounds and cannonballed into them with a splash like crunchy water. My old Labrador retriever with his gray face would find the energy to join in the fun, pouncing on top of me with a vivaciously wagging tail. The neighborhood was always decorated for fall. There was nothing creepy or scary at all. Hay bales and scarecrows peppered the subdivision along with the old dried-up corn stalks. Every house had a jack-o'-lantern. We'd spread out old newspaper over the table to carve my pumpkin, cutting off the top. I'd scoop out the sticky fruit and separate the seeds. Mom would wash the seeds and salt them up before baking them in the oven, while I cut out triangular eyes, a nose, and a goofy smile with only a few teeth. A candle was always placed in the center, giving the pumpkins a ghoulish glow. Homework was done with haste. A shower was taken early. Dinner was served before dark. My costume was never anything fancy. A plastic character suit with a hard-to-see-through plastic mask that was held on by a thin rubber band. Yet, I was proud of my costume, excited to be for one night the character I chose, all ruined by an overly concerned mom who demanded I wear a jacket. The streetlights came on and the subdivision filled with kids accompanied by adults. There were vampires and princesses, robots and witches. Some costumes were homemade, some were store-bought, some were extravagant, and some were cheap. None of us kids cared. It was Operation Candy. My parents released me like I was a hungry jackal looking for a carcass to feed from. Mom would always stay home to hand out the candy while Dad double-timed it to keep up with me as I ran from house to house. The Fambros' house was always a good one. Their mom would dress up as a silly scarecrow, much like the one from The Wizard of Oz, and sit out on the front porch. She would ask us if we wanted a trick or a treat. If you answered trick, she would do cartwheels or sing and dance, something funny to entertain us kids. I'd pick trick just for a laugh. The Bedwell's home was my favorite. On their porch, they had a scarecrow they called Old Jeb Brown. It was made of denim overalls and a red and black plaid flannel shirt stuffed with straw, boots for feet, gloves for hands, and a jack-o'-lantern for the head. Inside the head they put a speaker. Mr. Bedwell would sit on the couch inside and wait for trick-or-treaters to walk up and then scare them. Even though I knew it was coming, he always managed to scare me. They would always invite us in and tell us the story of Old Jeb Brown. Old Jeb once owned all the land the subdivision was built on. For many years, he lived a reclusive lifestyle on the edge of town. He rarely accepted visitors, and never when they were unannounced. He built a rickety barbed wire fence around his property and posted signs that read, "No trespassing. Violators will be shot on sight." He posted those about every 50 yards or so, according to the story. People, for the most part, took that warning seriously. However, every Halloween, there were those few who would bang on his door and yell, "Trick or treat!" Old Jeb would greet them at the door with a rifle in hand. People would go scurrying away. Jeb would always fire a warning shot to let them know to never come back. Late one night on Halloween 1953, a group of teens felt it was their place to teach old Jeb a lesson in politeness. They snuck up his driveway, threw a flaming bag of poo on his porch, banged on the door, and hit. Jeb never woke to put out the flaming bag, and it caught his porch on fire. The teens who were hiding in the shadows ran off. Jeb died in the house fire. Mr. Bedwell went on to tell us that the following Halloween, those kids went missing, and that they weren't the only ones. There have been cases of missing teens on Halloween over the decades. He believes it was the ghost of old Jeb Brown exacting revenge on bad kids on the anniversary of his death. As a young kid, the story did a good job of scaring me straight, but when I turned 13, it was just a bunch of malarkey. At that age, I hit a growth spurt and was too big to trick-or-treat. The little things like jumping in the leaves, carving jack-o'-lanterns, and the magic of autumn were lost on me. Frankly, I hated the season because it meant school was well underway. That year, Halloween fell on a Friday, and 2 of my friends stayed the night at my house. They told me there were other ways to have fun on Halloween than trick-or-treating. We waited until my parents went to bed. We grabbed toilet paper, all the eggs we had, and a couple ball bats. We snuck out of the house late that night. We found a neighbor's house with no lights on and threw toilet paper in their trees, covering it. We then egged their car using half the eggs we had. Then we destroyed their decorations and smashed their mailbox. A light came on in the house and we took off running, dodging behind another house so we wouldn't get caught. We found it all exhilarating, laughing at our antics. We took a shortcut through the yards to the opposite street, Mr. Bedwell's street. My friend saw old Jeb the Scarecrow and immediately wanted to ruin it. I told them I didn't want to mess with that house, that I knew the guy, but they didn't want to listen. They started with the toilet paper, just like the last place. Then they moved on to egging the front of his house. My one friend, Jimmy, grabbed a large landscaping stone from Mr. Bedwell's yard and threw it through his bay window. They turned to run, but Jimmy didn't get away. Old Jeb jumped up and grabbed him. Me and my other friend Ricky screamed in fright, but were not about to leave our friend. We started hitting the Scarecrow with the bats, but the bats didn't faze it. By then the lights were on in Mr. Bedwell's house. He was furious but ran outside to help Jimmy. The Scarecrow knocked Mr. Bedwell down and ran off with Jimmy. We chased old Jeb all the way to the graveyard. There, Jimmy started sinking into the ground and the Scarecrow fell into a limp pile of clothes and straw. We grabbed a hold of Jimmy and pulled with all our might, but something stronger was pulling him down. We screamed for him to hold on, but the dirt was rising up over his face. His hands slipped from our grasp, and he was gone. We didn't have time to mourn or dig. The Scarecrow stood back up, alive, and stomped towards us with intent. We scrambled to our feet and ran, but not fast enough. Old Jeb caught Ricky and started dragging him down to the grave. I grabbed Ricky in a bear hug, hoping to keep him above the soil, but I started to sink as well. I let go of Ricky and climbed out. I looked at Ricky. I saw terror in his eyes, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to end up like him and Jimmy. I was scared, so I ran, and I didn't look back. When I got home, I quietly snuck back inside and went to my room upstairs. I looked out the window and there it was, staring up at me. I sat on my bed watching it. It never moved, not until the sun came up and it collapsed into a pile of straw and clothes again. 30 years later, and I still have to lock myself in my house every Halloween night. The ghost of old Jeb Brown sits outside and waits. He was laying content on his large bed, idly humming a tune he had heard today. His hair was tousled and he was almost asleep, barely clinging to consciousness. Alcohol was lowly simmering in his veins, buzzing and addictive. He was rather satisfied with life in general at this moment. His eyes were half-lidded, and he didn't give a single damn about the world right now. He closed his eyes, running thoughts coursing through his mind. He had a good day today. He had argued towards a case that most considered very difficult, even impossible to win. He had felt accomplished when he had shut down the opposing party's arguments. He knew by his achievements today that he would most definitely will win the case. After that, he had gone out with some of his co-workers for drinking. He had a great time with them. He may have boasted a bit about his successes, but why shouldn't he? He deserved some praises for his accomplishments, and they didn't seem bothered anyway. He smiled. Yes, he deserved some praises. He wasn't vain. He didn't think he was. But sometimes being appreciated could build up a lot of confidence and self-worth in oneself. He deserved this. He closed his eyes again, his breathing deepening, and he felt his muscles growing lax. And before he knew it, he was already drifting off. His mind calming down, his limbs growing heavy, and his mind still lingering on a subconscious, almost forgotten thought. Did he actually deserve it? Wake up, wake up, wake up. He awoke with a gasp, his hands clutching his throat. His eyes widened in terror as he woke from some unknown horror that was lingering in his consciousness. It felt like he was ripped from one reality and dumped unceremoniously in another. He didn't know what has woken him, but he felt his thoughts jumbled up in an incoherent mess. It felt like some unknown entity or being was still laying curled up on his mind, still clutching some part of his mind even as he tried to drift away from, as he started waking up. He lay panting, his breaths heaving and his body trembling. His heart felt like it was trying to beat out of his chest, and he couldn't control the growing panic he felt rising in his veins. He curled in on himself, his head pressed against his knees, as he took calming breaths and tried to stop himself from shaking so badly. After what felt like an eternity, he finally managed to stop shaking. His breathings had calmed down, and he overall felt more like a human being than a brain that had overridden on adrenaline. After gathering himself remarkably, but not before the tinge of embarrassment that clung onto him drove deep and stabbed his ego, he sat up on his bed and ran a hand through his hair, finding sweat sticking his hair to his forehead. He noticed just then that his bed had turned rather uncomfortable during the night. It was harder than he remembered being. He frowned, feeling his mattress with his hand carefully. He was not on his bed, he realized as he looked down. He was on asphalt. Someone has dragged him onto asphalt whilst he has been sleeping. He felt an uncomfortable feeling rise in him, along with panic as he continued to stare at the asphalt incredulously. He took a deep breath, calming his nerves, and then turning to examine his situation more, he looked up. He was in hell. His breath stuttered in the throat. The rising feeling of nausea and horror coursed through him as he watched his surroundings. Everything was in ruins around him. Buildings were demolished on the surrounding horizon, where he laid. It was as if it was razed to the ground. The destruction was breathtaking in its savagery. The sun was beating down on him, and it felt uncomfortable just sitting down in it. There was no breeze, not that he could tell, but the stench was acidic in its nature. He didn't know how he didn't notice before. It was so awful. But more than any of that, the true horror lied in the piles and piles of garbage surrounding him. It was so horrifying in its nature that it was almost marvelous. His heartbeat picked up in his terror, sweat beading at his temples, as he took everything with a surreal repulsion. He couldn't believe what he was seeing was true. He contemplated if he was dreaming, but this felt too real for a dream. and he never did dream lucidly before, so he didn't know what to make of his current circumstances. He got up on shaky legs and stumbled when he did. This place, wherever he was awful. He walked around, searching for some kind of reprieve from this too real nightmare, but didn't find any. Everywhere he went, everywhere he saw, was filled with destruction and garbage. So much garbage. He looked around for anything beautiful, anything that was not covered in garbage, but didn't find any such place. He searched for trees, shrubs, grass, anything that would take away the stench of the place. He didn't find anything. His eyes watered as he searched for some sort of positive in the hell that he had landed in. Nothing. There was nothing but this wreckage. He frantically searched more, but the result was the same. Just as he was doing his searches around what he thought appeared to be a city, he heard crying. A child's crying. He ran in the direction of the noise, panic rising in his throat. He looked around for the sound as he was in general vicinity of it, and finally came across an enclosure surrounded by broken walls of a building. There was a child there, a toddler. He ran towards it, heart in his throat, but before he could fully reach the child, something in him stopped him. He stood there watching the child, his breathing echoing in the place. The child didn't stop crying, its hiccuping breaths resounding in his ears. The child looked at him and stopped crying. It smiled, its big brown eyes shimming as he babbled at him. Ray, hinging its arm in an innocent command to be held. He didn't move from his place. He continued to watch the child in some sort of trance, but the child didn't appear happy with his inactivity. It hiccuped, sobbing softly, then growing louder as he still stood there and watched. As he was watching the child sob, he noticed as the tears dropping from his eyes turned to a tar-like substance, the drool in his mouth turned to the same substance. He watched in horror as the baby cried a goo-like black liquid. He stood in shock and watched as the baby vomited the tar and hiccuped and raised his arms again and again, asking him to carry him. He didn't move towards it. In fact, he took a step backwards from it. The baby's cries turned louder, its eyes getting covered in tar. It kept vomiting and crying. He kept taking steps back from it. Just then he blinked, and then the baby seemed to have multiplied. There were several children all around the baby's age surrounding it, all of them crying out, vomiting the black material, their cries growing louder and louder, and he felt a headache developing. When one tried to reach for him, he threw it off his legs and stumbled backward. The fallen child started crying even more at his treatment and tried to reach him again, but he wouldn't have it. He took several steps backwards and started to run away from the children. He ran and he ran, putting as much distance between him and the babies. He was horrified by what he saw, not quite still able to understand it. Just then he tripped on a piece of rubble and stumbled in a pair of arms. He was righted by the person who had caught him. He took a breath, looking back at the place he had ran away from. He panted and looked up, and he froze. It was his Anya, his beautiful Anya, his beloved fiancée. She smiled gently down at him, and he felt himself growing calmer as he looked at her. She cupped his cheeks and caressed his lips. "We should get out of here," he told her when he finally got his breathing in control, frantic yet still coherent. She didn't say anything, her beautiful white dress fluttering in a poignant wind. She took his hands in hers and smiled again, her eyes full love and affection. He looked down at her hands as they started gripping him tight, but then looked up again to tell her to leave with him when he saw her skin turn wrinkled, and ashy. Her eyes started pouring the same tar-like substance, and she had still not stopped smiling at him. The liquid dripped from her lips, and she kept smiling. Her smile, somewhere without him knowing, turned eerie. He shook off her hands and stumbled back, and she still smiled at him. She reached out a hand, but not towards him, but towards her own throat, and started tearing into it. He let out a cry, almost running towards her in order to make her stop, but he didn't. He stood stock still and watched her tear her own windpipe out. She was not dripping blood, but the same tar-like substance. He saw her take a step towards him. He wanted to move away, but he found that he couldn't move. He just watched numbly as she handed him her windpipe and smiled. He watched in horror at the grotesque image of his fiancée smiling at him with a torn throat. He watched and still watched as suddenly she started coughing and clutching her throat, the black substance running down her mouth and her torn throat. She gestured towards the sky, which has turned red, and gestured towards her mouth and nose. She mouthed something at him, and his numbly understood what she was trying to say. Couldn't breath. Air too bad. Help. He stood there and watched her get suffocated, even with a torn throat. He was still holding her windpipe. He collapsed on the ground, crying out, his mind, his thoughts, a jumbled mess. He was crying so hard he didn't notice darkness surrounding Anya. He didn't even notice when it suddenly surrounded him. He was surfing in the darkness when he came to. A speck of nothing and something in the same second. He didn't know if he was, but he did know he could be. The miracle was stretching and encroaching. He felt at the same time both safe and in more danger than he ever been in. "So you come here finally," Travis said firmly, "without permission and without even bothering to ask me." A voice said from unseen sources and in the darkness. He didn't know who it was, but it felt all-encompassing. Her stimulation board crashes in a flash of light and heat, as painful as anything Dean had ever inflicted on him. "Look at us," the voice roared. "Look at the reality of your being." He cowered and called into the darkness. "Who are you? What was that? What do you want from me?" "That was what your future could be," the voice said. "Little human, not forgotten, ruining everything in its way, repenting not, as everything turns to dust and hay." "Good? What?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "You ruin everything you touch," the voice said. "Think of us. Think of the earth. We are the earth, and you ruin us. Great job." "God, speak to the people?" Just as he was comprehending what the voices said, he was flung back in the void, and he kept falling, and then he landed. He opened his eyes with a gasp, looking around himself and taking in his room. He was back in his room. He had the sick feeling still clutching his stomach, and he couldn't let go of the dream he had had. Was it a dream? He didn't know. He didn't know anything. He stood up from his bed and looked down when his foot almost slipped on a tar-like substance. He gasped and cried, his body heaving and panicking, and he stayed there for a very long time before he got up. He had a job to do. That day, Edward Notron willingly lost a case where a big cooperation was trying to take a large part of the environment in order to make artificial environment, trying to replicate. What most didn't know was that if it would have happened, the Earth would have slowly died. As it was, a bomb perhaps would have gone off. Edward became a silent hero who was never known for his contribution.